There ain't no surer way to find out whether you like people or hate them than to travel with them.
Mark Twain was an American original whose engaging stories made him a global icon. He was a satirist, lecturer, and writer. The New York Times once called Twain the greatest humorist this country has produced. But before Tom Sawyer, before Huckleberry Finn, and long before he was known as the father of American literature, Mark Twain worked as a little-known roving newspaper correspondent.
Anyone who reads a newspaper might have caught his name, but he's not a literary figure at this point.
Twain's big break came in 1867, when he convinced the owners of a San Francisco newspaper, the Daily Alta California, to pay his fare on the world's first cruise ship.
To the proprietors of the Alta California, send me $1,200 at once. I want to go abroad. Yours truly, Mark Twain.
The brash 31-year-old reporter would take passage on the Quaker City steamer bound for Europe, the Holy Land, and the ancient walled city of Jerusalem.
Twain's wanderlust is very interesting. He had this need to get out, to move on, to see something new. And what better than to travel halfway across the globe?
One of his favorite phrases that he used again and again was move, move, move.
This momentous voyage would establish Twain as the voice of America. Funny, sarcastic, and powerfully opinionated. His irreverent letters and droll articles resulted in a best-selling travelogue, The Innocents Abroad. The book would skyrocket Twain to fame, and the journey would transform everything in his life. Missouri rests on the banks of the Mississippi River. It is in this house that Samuel Clemens, better known by his pen name Mark Twain, grew up. His adventurous childhood in this small river town would have a profound influence on his life, writings, and religious beliefs. From an early age, Twain regularly attended church services with his beloved mother, Jane Lambton Clemens, a deeply devout Christian. Twain's own beliefs were deep-rooted, complex, and contradictory, and he was much more educated on Christianity and the Bible than most would suppose.
Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, had a constant, lifelong, sort of jilted love affair with the Bible. He wanted to believe, but he couldn't believe.
It ain't those parts of the Bible that I can't understand that bothers me. It is the parts that I do understand.
In the late 19th century, most of what ordinary people knew of the Holy Land came from magnificent stories taught in church. Stories of majestic and epic proportions.
Little Sammy Clemens sat in those hard pews and heard that icy Calvinist version of Christianity and been terrified by it, was also mesmerized by it.
25 years later, Mark Twain would take the journey of a lifetime and visit these mythical places.
Came east last January for the Daily Alta California of San Francisco, and will sail on the 8th of June.
The Quaker City, a 1,500-ton side-wheel steamer equipped with sails, sits at the foot of Wall Street in New York Harbor. Just a few years earlier, she'd been a gunboat with the Union Navy during the American Civil War. Her current mission is strictly civilian and purely pleasure.
It was the beginning of what we would call today modern commercial tourism. People traveled before, people traveled to the Holy Land before, but this is the first of what we would recognize today as being tourists.
It was a novelty in the way of excursions. It's like had not been thought of before. It was to be a picnic on a gigantic scale.
The daily Alta California newspaper agreed to pay Twain's hefty fare.
He wrote a telegram to the Alta California just saying, I want to go to Europe, send me the money, and they did. And so he was aboard with credentials.
In return, Twain will send back 50 articles. He also arranged to send dispatches to 2 popular New York newspapers as well.
He knew that he had to do in his life was penetrate the Eastern literary aristocracy. And the voyage to the Holy Land aboard the Quaker City was to be his calling card, and he understood that.
It is within 12 hours of leaving, and I have not been to bed or packed my trunk yet. Now, I feel good. I feel damn good. And I could write a good correspondence. You'll see.
When he began the cruise, he's more or less just a comic performer. He's known as a Western humorist. He's what I would characterize at that point of his life as a bohemian. He's counterculture.
He was irascible, endlessly curious. He had an alarming amount of energy and nothing to lose, which makes for a great recipe for comedy. It is a very key period in his life.
The passengers on the Quaker City were a cross-section of the new Main Street America.
The small-town businessmen and preachers and doctors and surgeons and their wives. Very pious, people who hadn't been very far from home, but people who had read diligently into the Bible and about the biblical Holy Lands. This was an almost out-of-body opportunity to see something that had been practically mystical.
On June 8, 1867, the Quaker City and her 65 passengers embark on an extraordinary 5-month voyage.
The ship wasn't even out of New York Harbor before he realized that the people around him were a priceless source of reportage and humor and American folklore.
He definitely likes making fun of himself and the others around him. And he does make fun of himself. He's an equal opportunity mocker.
As the excursion went on, the humor that he found in these people was sort of replaced by a kind of distaste for their incessant piety, their nightly prayer meetings.
Oh, grant that they may find it easy today.
Among the most pious members of the group is Colonel William Denny, an ex-Confederate officer and shipboard expert on biblical history. He led many of the nightly prayer meetings, which most of the faithful dutifully attended. Typically absent, Mark Twain.
He was the one who conspicuously did not join in the prayer meetings. He organized a little group of like-minded young men who called themselves the Quaker City Nighthawks. Later, they called themselves the Sinners.
They are people who play cards, smoke, drink, and basically have a good time.
He's kind of the James Dean of the 19th century. He's a bad boy. He loves being a bad boy.
Dear folks, I have got a splendid, immoral, tobacco-smoking, wine-drinking, godless roommate who is as good and true and right-minded a man as ever lived.
When Mark Twain is in the presence of people who are maintaining they are better than he is because they are sober or don't smoke or because they are religious, he tends to kind of want to tweak them a little bit.
Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts.
The travelers sail to the venerated Old World, the European mainland, where they will visit Spain, Italy, and France.
Americans in the mid-19th century still had a strong inferiority complex about Europe, and Europe was very happy to reinforce that inferiority complex.
Everything was to be looked at with a degree of reverence. Twain does not possess that, apparently, in his genetic makeup. He's not going to go over there and be intimidated or be impressed. In effect, Europe has to prove itself to Twain.
The people of those foreign countries are very, very ignorant. In Paris, they simply opened their eyes and stared when we spoke to them in French. We never did succeed in making those idiots understand their own language.
In Paris, we see a great deal of Twain as the comic performer, working on his shtick. There's a wonderful scene where he goes into the Parisian barber to have himself beautifully coiffed.
From earliest infancy, it had been a cherished ambition of mine to be shaved someday in a palatial barber shop of Paris.
Unable to find the mythical Parisian barber of his dreams, Twain finds himself in the shabby back room of a wig-maker's shop.
The first rake of his razor loosened the very hide from my face and lifted me out of the chair. He dried my features with a towel and was going to comb my hair, but I asked to be excused. It was sufficient to be skinned. I declined to be scalped.
His encounter with a Parisian barber begins a series of disappointments. They're manhandled and manipulated by self-indulgent tour guides.
As they moved on into Italy, into Venice and Naples, he began to focus on the squalor, the poverty at the fringes of the cathedrals. And even the priests, he found, were more primitive and barbaric and superstition-ridden than he'd imagined from his Sunday school books.
I think there's a church every 50 yards all over town. Every now and then one comes across a friar of orders. They're all fat and greasy. The generality of them would yield oil like a whale.
The contentedness of these monks who are supposed to be serving humanity, they're fat, and the people outside are starving.
To a large extent, Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad is a document of disillusionment. That almost everything he sees and describes is a disappointment to one extent or another.
This was the first time that an American had dared pull back the curtain and show the squalor beneath the image of European splendor.
Twain's letters to the California newspaper become increasingly cynical.
If you express skepticism about all these things that everyone else holds in reverence, you run the danger of seeming like a Philistine, someone who is ignorant and who doesn't know what he's talking about. Mark Twain manages to guard against that.
That over and over he experiences something and says, gee, that's not the way I expected it. And I'm going to give you the truth. This is a newspaper. I'm going to see it as you would see it if you were here. So he becomes an everyman for the American.
The readers of the Alta California loved what Twain was sending back to them. This could have been a moon expedition for all the familiarity that they had with Europe and the Holy Land.
Twain, by the time he gets to Rome, is exhausted with great works of art, tour guides who want him to be amazed and stupefied by how overwhelmingly beautiful these artifacts are.
In Milan, in an ancient tumble-down ruin of a church, is the mournful wreck of the most celebrated painting in the world. The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. It is battered and scarred in every direction, and stained and discolored by time. To us, the great uncultivated, it is the last thing in the world to call a picture.
He wanted to make a virtue out of what Americans had felt was a shortcoming. Europe was enslaved to its dead saints and martyrs and great painters.
Twain says, Europe is growing monotonous to me. Europe is dead. What a great prelude to the Holy Land, which is really dead in Mark Twain's attitudes.
Over the next 3 weeks, the steamer docks at ports in Greece, Russia, and Turkey. In Constantinople, Twain has a special photograph taken of himself known as a carte visite.
There were photographers named Abdullah Freres who were actually famous, and a number of the passengers have their photographs taken there. People carried with them carte de visites, much the way you might carry a business card.
Dear folks, they take the finest photographs in the world here. I have ordered some.
The Quaker City makes the short journey from Turkey to Lebanon. It is here that they will make their final preparations for the journey to the Holy Land and Jerusalem.
They finally reach Beirut in early September. Now they're getting into the heart of the journey. The Quaker City passengers break off into smaller groups and they go their separate ways.
American travelers wishing to explore the Holy Land frequently began their journey in Beirut. Here, the U.S. consul assisted travelers with documentation while also providing English-speaking guides, known as dragomen.
They're more than guides showing you around. The dragoman negotiated all of the arrangements, provided all accommodations, horses, food. They were able to come up with everything that you could possibly imagine.
Sam wants to join a group of men that is going to make the most difficult trek of all. They're going to go south 55 miles to Damascus and then another 155 miles to Jerusalem, the cradle of Christian faith. The trek will have to be made across burning desert, temperatures well over 100 degrees. So most of the passengers are just simply not able to do this.
The rest of the travelers wisely choose to stay on board the Quaker City and sail to Palestine, where all of the pilgrims will reunite and begin their explorations of the Holy Land together. In a letter back home, Twain describes the terms of his forthcoming adventure.
Dear folks, we shall be in the saddle 3 weeks, and we pay $5 a day apiece in gold. Love to all. Yours, Sam.
The trip was grueling from the start. Dragomen could protect the travelers from attacks from Bedouins, but not from the punishing conditions.
It was hot, dry. There are places where they can't get water because Islamic residents do not want Christians to profane their wells. And there were hostilities.
The inconvenience of travel at that particular time, just how primitive it was. It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable, nobody died.
Mark Twain was a guy who had actually experienced some pretty rough living in the American West. He understood that on this overland expedition that they would be living in tents, and what he was thinking of was something like a Western camping trip, where he would sleep on the ground in a bedroll and maybe a pup tent over him. The first night they stopped and set up camp, it was like something out of a Arabian Nights caravan. Mark Twain was astounded.
Behold, 5 stately circus tents were up, high enough for a family of giraffes to live in. I was speechless. We had serving men and pack mules. I wondered what in the very mischief we wanted with such a turnout as that. For 8 men?
The meals were set out on tables with fine tablecloths and silverware and crystal and excellent food.
For the first time, the travel books got it right. This image of the Arabs popping up these tents and living in luxury was true.
Unbelievable.
And much of the trip so far, nothing had lived up to that expectation.
Early the next morning, the group saddles up for the demanding trek across Syria's scorching Bekaa Valley.
They had what would normally be a 3-day journey that they tried to compress into 2 days so that the pious members of the party would not have to travel on the Sabbath because they considered that sacrilegious.
What they decide to do is to drive their horses as fast and as hard as they can. Despite the fact that the animals are weak, that they're undernourished, that some of them have horrible sores, and the Christians, the pilgrims, are unmoved.
This is the point in The Innocents Abroad where Sam's sort of playful skepticism toward the pilgrims turns dark and turns really into anger.
We were all perfectly willing to keep the Sabbath day, but there are times when to keep the letter of a sacred law whose spirit is righteous becomes a sin.
Twain and his weary companions have now navigated more than 8,000 miles of land and sea and are finally nearing the legendary land of the Bible. After this incredible journey, the intrepid travelers arrive at the ancient Roman city of Banyas. From these ruins, just a few miles above the Jordan River, they gaze out at the hallowed ground of the Promised Land.
For Twain and his travelers, Banyas was the first location in the Holy Land where they're coming in contact with the New Testament. Literally the place where Christianity was founded. This was the first holy site in the Holy Land.
I think that at the moment they entered the Holy Land, something of Sam's early excitement and wonderment returned to him, because this really was the place where Jesus walked, the place he'd read about as a boy.
This is the first place we have ever seen whose pavements were trodden by Jesus Christ.
But that moment quickly disappeared. Things got back to normal, which was to say hot, dusty, irreverent, hypocritical.
What fascinates Mark Twain most as he enters the Holy Land is not so much the Holy Land itself and its various relics and temples and shrines, but the highly artificial response of the pilgrims who he's traveling with. He's amused at their weeping over various tombs and sites. He's repulsed at their vandalism of these same sites.
I wish this vandalism could be stopped. They have been hacking and chipping these old arches here that Jesus looked upon in the flesh.
What is being taken away now are fragments that even Sam, in his religious skepticism, see as a desecration.
He calls them vandals, i.e. the people who destroyed Rome. Boorish, insensitive. Now, it's meant to be funny, but I think it's not. I mean, there's a degree to which you sense that this is a criticism that should be taken to heart.
The troop moves on towards the legendary Sea of Galilee, near the ruins of the ancient synagogue in Capernaum. This is where Jesus based his ministry, and where he is said to have performed many of his healing miracles.
With the Sea of Galilee, you have the clash of the romantic and realism. You have the group of pilgrims whose dream it has always been, apparently, to sail across the Sea of Galilee and to have a deeply spiritual moment and to affirm themselves with God.
These men have read about the Sea of Galilee all their lives. They never expected to see it, and here they are, and they're agog with wonder.
The pilgrim enthusiasts of our party, who had been so wild with religious ecstasy ever since they touched holy ground that they did little but mutter incoherent rhapsodies. So anxious were they to take shipping and sail upon the waters that had upheld the sacred feet of the Savior.
When they arrive, they're talking in terms of there's no price too high in order to ride on the waters of Galilee. And an Arab boat comes along, and they ask how much they will charge for a ride. And when the Arabs quote them a figure, the pilgrims say, that's too high.
It turns out it's just $8. Considering what they've spent on this trip, $8 is a drop in the bucket. They try to dicker the price down. You don't want our price? We're gone.
They've waited their lifetime for the experience, and they've just blown the opportunity. So then they turn on one another.
They're bickering amongst themselves. They're very human after all. Their holier-than-thou self-righteousness gets punctured.
No word was spoken by the sinners. Even the mildest sarcasm might have been dangerous.
And the funniest line of all is one of them turns to Colonel Denny and says, well, Denny, do you wonder now that Christ walked?
The thwarted group camps in Tiberias along the rocky shore of Galilee. Here, Twain compares Galilee to his beloved Lake Tahoe.
The celebrated Sea of Galilee is not so large a sea as Lake Tahoe. Footnote: I measure all lakes by Tahoe. And when we come to speak of beauty, this sea is no more to be compared to Tahoe than a meridian of longitude is to a rainbow.
He lets nothing go. Everything gets belittled and diminished. When he gets to Lake Como in Italy, he says Tahoe is better. When he gets to Galilee, he says Tahoe's better. If you want beauty, go to America. America is better.
It has been nearly 4 months since the travelers left New York City. Now they are just days away from their grand destination, the holiest place on earth, Jerusalem.
The route that Twain and the Pilgrims took was the most traveled route from ancient times to modern history.
No landscape exists that is more tiresome to the eye than that which bounds the approaches to Jerusalem. Rocks, 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 roads infernal, thought we never would get there.
The approach to Jerusalem was very harsh, was very rocky, was very bleak, was with no vegetation. And this is what Twain saw.
At last, away in the middle of the day, ancient bits of wall and crumbling arches began to line the way. We toiled up one more hill, and every pilgrim and every sinner swung his hat on high. Jerusalem.
Just after noon, the invigorated party entered the narrow, crooked streets of the old city by the famous Damascus Gate. Twain and his companions take lodging in the Mediterranean Hotel.
This was a refreshing change for Twain and the pilgrims, coming from 3 weeks of tent life and horseback riding into a modern hotel of the time, with good wine, good meals, good accommodation, with each one having his little bed, his room, his basin, and toilets. Obviously was a change, and a relaxing change.
So refreshing that Mark Twain does not leave the hotel the entire first day. He records in his journal,
Loafed all the afternoon in the Mediterranean Hotel.
For over a century, Twain's lodgings were thought to be lost to history until recently, when historians, through meticulous research, discovered the building to still exist.
The telltale evidence that this is the courtyard of the Mediterranean Hotel back in 1867 was by a photo of a woman grinding wheat. But it's not only the grinding of the wheat, it was also the stairs, the door, the window, and the crack on the floor in the flagstone, which is still here till today.
It is from this historic setting that Mark Twain began his exploration of Jerusalem.
I think the Holy Land attracted Mark Twain immediately for journalistic reasons. He knew it would be good copy, and it was, but in a deeper sense, he had been marinated in the mythology of the Holy Land since boyhood.
When he enters Jerusalem, he is deeply excited. He really is thrilled to be there. This actually strips away a lot of his cynicism. He does recognize that there is something deeply profound and meaningful about this place. This is a place, if nothing else, has an enormous history to it. He's trying to figure out how to reconcile that with how small it is.
A fast walker could go outside the walls of Jerusalem and walk entirely around the city in an hour. I do not know how else to make one understand how small it is.
It was dirty and crowded and noisy and smelly, and it was not a pleasant place to come to when you expected Jerusalem to be like the scriptures.
The appearance of the city is peculiar. It is as knobby with countless little domes as a prison door is with bolt heads. The streets are roughly and badly paved with stone and are intolerably crooked.
For Twain, it underscores the disappointment. The Holy Land is not the place that I imagined when I read the Bible. It's not as big, it's not as beautiful, it's not as impressive.
Even some of the pilgrims like Denny can't help but be a little disappointed.
He kept hearing the word bakshish, bakshish, money, alms, let's make a deal. I think another devastating blow to Sam's expectations of the Holy Land went beyond the squalor and the barrenness of the land. The people themselves living in the Holy Land were hardly ennobled. Here was human misery on a scale unimaginable to American eyes.
I have a religion. You may call it blasphemy. It is that there is a God for the rich man and none for the poor.
In 1867, the population of Jerusalem is composed of Muslims, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Syrians, Copts, Catholics, and Protestants. Muslims and Christians in Jerusalem outnumber the roughly 4,000 Jews in the city. 3 short years later, the Jewish population will be the majority.
Mark Twain talks about the Jews remarkably little in terms of looking at real live ones in the Holy Lands.
He's got these usual garden variety prejudices about Jews, but he doesn't feel superior to them. He doesn't feel that he wants to make fun of them, and he doesn't. You do not find anti-Semitic humor anywhere in Mark Twain.
Twain and his fellow travelers visit Jerusalem's historic sites, including the Dome of the Rock. This Muslim holy site sits on the ancient ruins of King Solomon's temple. Twain becomes peeved when the self-righteous Colonel Denny refuses to remove his shoes as required by Muslim custom.
To step rudely upon the sacred praying mats with booted feet, a thing not done by any Arab, was to inflict pain upon men who had not offended us in any way.
He became disgusted by their boorishness, their hypocrisy, their kind of lack of imagination.
If it happens to have a deep spiritual significance to someone else, well, it doesn't matter because you're not my religion anyway. And that appalls him. That just infuriates him.
If Christ were here, there is one thing he would not be: a Christian.
Twain's tour culminates at Jerusalem's most sacred Christian site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
It was the goal of every pilgrim to come to Jerusalem, to this place, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This was the core. The life, death, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ. This is where those major events took place that founded Christianity.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is set up to be a pilgrimage site, but in our eyes today, we could see it very much in the way that certain tourist sites are set up.
All these biblical shrines were placed here in the 4th century by Saint Helena, the mother of the great Roman Emperor Constantine. She built this great monument to enclose the holy places under one roof.
He sees it as a kind of theme park. All of these venues very conveniently arranged so as to be within easy access of one another.
Twain approaches the tomb of Jesus, located in the rotunda at the center of the church. What he saw was astonishing.
Over it hang some 50 gold and silver lamps, which are kept always burning. And the place is otherwise scandalized by trumpery, gewgaws, and tawdry ornamentation.
I think this is where you can see that both his Enlightenment rationalism and his deep Protestantism converge very powerfully. I mean, these are low church Protestants. They don't want smells and bells. They want a simple church, plain pine benches, a pulpit, no cross, no bleeding, no thorns, none of those ornaments that are supposed to whoop up your enthusiasm. What is all this stuff doing here? When he gets to the putative tomb of Adam and he just goes into bathos, tomb of Adam? Where would there be a tomb of Adam? How would anybody know where Adam was buried? Why would it be here?
The grave of Adam. How touching it was, here in a land of strangers, far away from home and friends and all who cared for me, thus to discover the grave of a blood relation. True, a distant one, but still a relation.
He pulls out all the stops. He's just not going to have any of this malarkey. This is what we were coming for? This is the climax? This petty bickering over these fraudulent artifacts? I mean, there's no way we can know if they're true.
He goes into this long riff. He pretends to break down and sobs because finally he's discovered the tomb of an ancestor.
I deem it no shame to have wept over the grave of my poor dead relative. Let him who would sneer at my emotion close this volume here, for he will find little to his taste in my journeyings through Holy Land.
It's another way to make fun, and he's a humorist. It's meant to be funny.
The impact of Twain's immensely popular writings would resonate for years. A decade later, former President Ulysses S. Grant would take a world tour.
He went to Jerusalem specifically, and interestingly enough, he carried, as many of the travelers did, a Bible in one hand, a tour book in the other, and a copy of The Innocents Abroad.
Like many tourists, Grant would visit the significant historical sites of Jerusalem.
When Grant went to the Church of Holy Sepulchre, he went to Adam's tomb. Now, what had been a shrine, a religious shrine, whether a pious fraud or not, had become a tourist site because travelers went to see where Mark Twain wept.
The final stop inside the Holy Sepulchre is the site of the crucifixion, as identified by St. Helena. Twain allows himself to soften here.
I could not believe that the 3 holes in the top of the rock were the actual ones the crosses stood in. But I felt satisfied that those crosses had stood so near the place now occupied by them that the few feet of possible difference were a matter of no consequence.
He says that event would have had some staying power. People would have remembered where that happened, and it would have been talked about for hundreds of years. That moment, Twain actually gives some credence to. He's moved.
The experience that Twain has when he finds himself at the site of the crucifixion is really profound for him and meaningful. He recognizes that this may have happened and gains some understanding into why religion is so powerful.
The next morning, after just one full day of exploring Jerusalem, Twain departs for a journey outside the Holy City. Before leaving, he handwrites instructions to a local merchant ordering a special handmade Bible. This document is the only known private letter written by Mark Twain while in the Holy Land.
Fix up the little Bible I selected. The one that has backs made of balsam wood from the Jordan, oak from Abraham's tree at Hebron, olive wood from the Mount of Olives. Put on it this inscription: Mrs. Jane Clemens, from her son. Mount Calvary, September 24, 1867.
It's an attempt to kind of please his mother. Mark Twain may be skeptical in the way he describes everything, but he's quite tolerant of other people's beliefs, so long as there's not hypocrisy about it.
He was deeply appreciative and respectful of people who did possess the faith, those he thought were genuine.
Over the next several days, Twain and his companions will visit sites to the east and south of Jerusalem. They stop in Jericho and swim in both the Dead Sea and the Jordan River.
When I was a boy, I somehow got the impression that the River Jordan was 4,000 miles long and 35 miles wide. It's only 90 miles long, and so crooked that a man does not know which side of it he's on half the time. It is not any wider than Broadway in New York.
Very early Friday morning, September 27th, they begin the almost 3-hour ride to the holy city of Bethlehem, the site of the Nativity.
I touch, with reverent finger, the actual spot where the infant Jesus lay. But I think nothing.
He was sort of shredding his Christian faith bit by bit, or his wish to be a Christian. This was almost a confirmation that the faith and all its iconography and all of its beautiful images were an illusion.
They expect to see the beautiful holy city revealed to them, and they get nothing. You have a very similar scenario in The Wizard of Oz, where you have this group set out, and in the end, it's just an old man working the controls.
He's been taught to believe that in the Holy Land, you'll find an encounter with God, that there is the one spot on the planet where the divine has been made human. Ultimately, though, it's a tourist attraction. It's a kind of Disneyland.
Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Palestine is no more of this workday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is dreamland.
On September 29th, despite it being the Sabbath, the pilgrims leave Jerusalem for good and head west to the port city of Jaffa, where the Quaker City awaits them.
Left Jerusalem at 3:30 in the afternoon and got away.
They are all relieved to be going back to the ship. Everyone wants to get home and out of this desert.
I record it here as a notable that not even our pilgrims wept. They are the very boys to go into sentimental convulsions at the merest shadow of a provocation. Yet they wept not over Jerusalem.
By Monday, all the passengers are safely back on board the ship. The pilgrimage is complete.
It was on the voyage back when he really was able to sit down and apply himself to finishing the dispatches that he owed the California paper.
Travel and experience mar the grandest pictures and rob us of the most cherished traditions of our boyhood. Well, let them go.
On November 19th, 1867, the Quaker City completes her extraordinary voyage and docks at the foot of Wall Street in New York Harbor.
The steamer Quaker City arrived yesterday morning and turned her menagerie of pilgrims loose on America. Their pilgrim's progress is ended, and they know more now than it is lawful for the gods themselves to know.
Upon his return, Twain was approached by a book publisher with a proposition that would alter the course of his life and of American literature.
A publisher by the name of Elisha Bliss of the American Publishing Company contacted him and said, "Would you consider revising and arranging these letters into book form?" Boy, would he ever.
Twain begins compiling the letters, reworking, adding, and refining his prose in order to reach a broader audience. He calls his book The Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress. It is published in July 1869. Twain dedicates the book
to my most patient reader and most charitable critic, my aged mother.
The Innocents Abroad was Mark Twain's best-selling book during his whole lifetime.
It remains irreverent and slangy, but not nearly as much as the dispatches were. He cut out references to nudity, to bodily functions, generally speaking, elevated the language.
It was so damned funny. It really was. Serious book reviewers had a serious book in their hands now, and they were reading it and finding themselves doubled up with laughter, and they had to admit it.
One major reviewer noted, "The book must be taken in interrupted doses. There is more fun in it than it is safe to swallow at once." The reviews of the book whet the public's appetite.
In 1867, Americans need to laugh after the Civil War, and that may be one reason why Innocents Abroad sells so phenomenally. They're promised a laugh on every page.
Over and over, you had people who were saying, "My God, this is fresh, this is original, this is wonderful."
And Americans embraced The Innocents Abroad. For many, it would be the first book they would ever own.
My books are like water. Those of the great geniuses are wine. Fortunately, everybody drinks water.
The Quaker City's grand pleasure excursion may not have been what Mark Twain had anticipated, but the end results were beyond his wildest dreams.
The Innocents Abroad transformed everything in Mark Twain's life, in his personal life, in his professional life, in his creative life.
He doesn't have to have a newspaper slot and write for the newspapers in order to make a living. He can actually write books.
Mark Twain will be an ardent traveler for the rest of his life, returning many times to Europe, but never again to the Holy Land.
I think Twain was enormously changed by his trip. He saw a world where cultures and peoples were really distinct. It filled him with enormous passion, and it really fed his curiosity to try and figure out this thing called mankind, which was a question that he wrestled with until his death.
As for the bitter feelings he harbors about the excursion, they are gradually mellowed with the passage of time and the triumph of success.
We have full comfort in one reflection, however. Our experiences in Europe have taught us that in time, the fatigue will be forgotten. The heat will be forgotten. The thirst, the persecutions of the beggars, and then all that will be left will be pleasant memories of Jerusalem. The gentle reader will never know what a consummate ass he can become until he goes abroad. I speak now, of course, in the supposition that the gentle reader has not been abroad, and therefore is not already a consummate ass.